Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power."
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
You don't know who you are. Look back into your past, brother. Look back into your past, sister. You don't know who you are. Look back into your past, sister. Look back into your past, brother.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radioverse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off by thanking you, all of you loyal listeners yet again, for joining us this weekend. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, August 22nd, 2026. We'll be diving right into things on this beautiful Black August Saturday, as we have a special three-piece of wisdom on the agenda for today, being curated by none other than our very own treasure trove of wisdom, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, as well as Freedom Now co-producer Dr. Gerald Horne. First up, he'll be joined on the line by Jess Wagner, Assistant Professor of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and author of the book Black Crip Modern, Race, Gender, and the Roots of Disability Consciousness. Then, Dr. Horne will be joined on the line by Stephen Small, professor at University of California, Berkeley's Graduate Division, and author of the book Black Liverpool, The Real Thing, West African, West Indian, and African American culture at the end of the 20th century. Finally, we're going to round things off with one more interview with Dr. Horne and Richard Meiselle, Associate Professor of History at the University of Houston and author of the book Backwater Blues, The Mississippi Flood of 1927 and the African American Imagination. Now, I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom, right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Jungle Brothers, Milt Jackson, Marquise Hill, John Coltrane, Larry Coryell, and Joe Henderson. Now, people, get ready for this train to come and taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Jess Wagner.
Reds for the blood and the blacks for the man. The green is the color that stands for the land. The reds for the blood and the blacks for the man. The green is the color that stands for the land. The reds for the blood and the blacks.
Riches of the earth,
the reds for the blood
the
and
suffering,
the blacks for the man.
the original
the green
people,
is the color that stands
all
for
the riches
the
of the earth.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Jess Wagner, Assistant Professor of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and author of the book Black Crip Modern, Race, Gender, and the Roots of Disability Consciousness. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Jess Wagner.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
And we're excited to have you. So why did you produce this book?
Thank you. So when I was in graduate school, I learned about this field of study called disability studies. And I knew it was something that I absolutely needed to pursue. And it spoke to me particularly as a disabled person and someone who had also lived my life surrounded by disabled people. And so I sought to study that through a feminist lens. And at the same time, I was working in modernisms, writ large, but also becoming particularly interested in Black modernisms and Black modernity. And when I say Black modernism, Black modernity, that can sort of encompass a lot of things. But I really did sort of zero in on the Harlem Renaissance. And I'm noticing that there are actually so many stories about illness and disability, and also how things like state violence or inaccessible housing was also producing disablement in the works of these authors and artists and thinkers. So I sought to sort of think about how do I pull these together? And there were folks who are already doing incredible work at the intersections of disability studies and critical race studies. So I was sort of looking to them as a guide while I'm like working with these more, contemporary ideas of disability alongside, how did disability become racialized in the early 20th century? So that was the genesis of the project, is, having these seemingly disparate interests that were actually incredibly linked, and I just didn't know it at the time.
To that end, who was Pauli Murray, and what role does she play in your book?
Absolutely. So Pauli Murray did so many incredible things, and folks might be particularly familiar with the coinage of Jane Crow. And thinking particularly about how the intersections of race and gender impacted Black life. Murray was also an incredible lawyer and also a person of faith, a pastor. And in this book, I am actually thinking particularly about the intersections of Pauli Murray seeking gender-affirming care in the mid-20th century, while also balancing their commitments to their home and disabled people that they love back home as well. And then all of the civil rights activism that Murray was engaging in. And Murray is often seen as, or elevated as, a kind of transgender visionary. And sometimes we ignore Murray's disability story because we're afraid to talk about queerness and disability together. So, through working in, Murray's archival papers and also looking at unpublished stories, we see this really complex portrait of how Murray was navigating all of those, varying intersections. So yeah, thank you for asking. It's just one of my favorite things to talk about in the book, because obviously you're going to experience mental distress when you're trying to seek a certain kind of care that gets denied to you over and over again, while balancing activism and familial caregiving at home.
And what about Claude McKay? Who was he, and how does he figure into your story?
Sure. So Claude McKay, a very important Harlem Renaissance writer who does not always necessarily get the due that he deserves. And McKay wrote this particularly fascinating book called Romance in Marseille. And there are some authors who have written about how disability operates in this book, because the foundation of it is that this man stows away on a ship. His name is La Fala. And he's sort of locked in a freezing water closet, and he loses both of his legs. And while he is seeking compensation for what has happened to him, we're also seeing an embracing of disability and desire because he is portrayed as someone who can fall in love, right? Who can, dance in different ways. And that's a really fascinating component of the book. But I was also interested in the ways that sex workers were represented in this book, and also how disability was touching them as well, both as people who were working with other people's bodies and thinking about disabled people's pleasure, and like that's a form of intimate care work, but also the distressing conditions, right, that sort of psychologically disabled these sex workers. So I was thinking it as like once you sort of bring gender into the lens, and sexuality as well, it's a bigger disability story than just La Fala.
And what about Zora Neale Hurston? Who was she, and how does she figure into your story?
Yeah, so Zora Neale Hurston actually was the germ of the project, and I began this journey looking at her short story titled My Most Humiliating Jim Crow Experience, which was actually part of a longer run. So each story would be titled My Most Humiliating Jim Crow Experience. And what Hurston does is sort of, subverts expectations around what this is going to be about. There's an expectation in terms of what's being represented at the time that it might have occurred, in a labor setting or a transportation setting. And that this experience would, likely be in the South. However, she subverts that narrative, and she's actually at a swanky doctor's office that her patron, Charlotte Osgood Mason, sent her to. And she is treated terribly, but instead of just leaving, she stays to make them uncomfortable. So she's doing these incredible forms of passive resistance, while she's being the subject of medical malpractice, medical abuse. And then she also leaves and refuses to pay. And I started thinking about, what are the ways in which this is also a form of disability politics, right? Resisting medical segregation. And if we sort of zoom out, then we get a much more expansive idea of what disability politics can be, if we think particularly about the ways that negatively racialized people were fighting against medical abuse.
And what about Chester Himes? Who was he, and how does he figure into your story?
Yeah, Chester Himes is a really interesting figure. He is typically known for writing crime stories, Harlem Renaissance author, writing noir, detective. Some of them are in carceral settings. And so that is what he is most known for. However, he also wrote this incredible and compelling and complicated book that has been republished. It was initially published as Cast the First Stone, and it was heavily redacted to take out all of the content regarding homosexuality in it. But it was actually very much about a queer relationship between disabled people in a prison, right? So Himes is doing, when this was republished in 1998, we got to see more of this. And it's interesting the ways in which Himes is exploring both the ways in which disability and disabled people can be very desirable, but also thinking through an abolitionist lens about the ways in which prison itself can be disabling. So I was very excited to sort of dive into that aspect of Himes, and it also fleshes out the reasons that Himes might have been interested in these other themes in his crime fiction.
And you also write about President Franklin D. Roosevelt. What do you have to say about him?
Correct. Yeah. So I talk about Roosevelt because Roosevelt himself, he made himself into a metaphor for, an allegedly ailing nation. So at the same time that Roosevelt is really trying to make sure that he is not seen as disabled, or that, he can sort of go from disability to not, being photographed in public in his chair, that the Healing Springs of Warm Springs, Georgia, has sort of like rehabilitated him back into this like, vigorous, non-disabled person. That optic was important, although we know that he, sort of continued to use a chair and continued to be a disabled person, was important for thinking about how do we rehabilitate the nation from the Great Depression into the New Deal era. And a lot of these principles and ideas were rooted in thinking about white ability. And disabled people of color and people of color in general were very much left out of many New Deal initiatives. And so at the same time that we're seeing this, emergence of what I've, been calling like white disability culture, right? An explosion of white disabled women's memoirs, policies for disabled veterans, an explosion in accessible technologies that were often going to white disabled people. Roosevelt was a part of this large fantasy that, deeply excluded disabled people who were not seen as rehabilitatable, what he says, those who can be salvaged and enabled. So you can see the ways in which, whiteness, masculinity, rehabilitation became very important to like a racialized category of disability during this time.
Finally, Jess Wagner, Assistant Professor of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, author of the book Black Crip Modern. What about the American with Disabilities Act? What role does it play in your story?
This is a great question because while I was, at the beginning of this project, I was also many years back learning about the differences between the disability rights movement and the disability justice movement. And there is, in some ways there are some reciprocal relationships, and in many other ways there are tensions, because the disability rights movement is often, in the past, very much white-led, focused on liability policy, making sure that people who already have access in some way to resources to get what they need, can, clinch that, right? And we know it's deeply imperfect. The ADA also defines in some ways who is and who is not disabled. And my book is interested in the histories of how that came to be. At the same time, the disability justice movement in the current moment is critiquing some of the shortcomings of the disability rights movement. It is primarily led by trans and queer people of color who say the state alone is not going to save us, and that we need to sort of look to each other, look to mutual aid, look to intersectional politics as a way to create a safety net that's outside of like federal and state fluctuations. And I saw that happening also in the work of these Harlem Renaissance authors and artists and thinkers who were critiquing the ways in which Black folks were left out of these, disability initiatives, right? And that exclusion also led to the ADA moment. And you can see the ways they were intersecting with disability justice thought and as sort of predecessors to that. So thank you so much for asking.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Jess Wagner, Assistant Professor of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, author of the book Black Crip Modern, Race, Gender, and the Roots of Disability Consciousness. But thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
Many thanks to Professor Waggoner for joining us and dropping knowledge on us this Saturday. Let's keep this thing moving right along and get back to Dr. Horne, who's on the line with Stephen Small.
For KPFK Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Stephen Small, professor at the Graduate School at UC Berkeley and author of the book Black Liverpool, The Real Thing, West African, West Indian, and Afro-American Culture at the End of the 20th Century. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Radio Los Angeles, Stephen Small.
Yes, thank you, Gerald. Thank you for the invitation to this interview, and I'm glad to be here.
And we're glad to have you. So why did you produce this book?
The goal of this book is to describe and explain the Black community and transnational Black culture in Liverpool at the end of the 20th century. Black Liverpool is important in and of itself, but it's also important because of what it contributes to the analysis of Black Britain more generally. And to understand that, we need to understand the context. The context is that in the final decades of the 20th century, the Black population in Britain increased significantly. In the 1940s, it was 50,000. In the 1970s, 400,000. And by 2001, it had increased to 1.1 million. This was still a tiny percentage of the national population. Most research on Black Britain is about this population, especially in London, people that arrived from the Caribbean to fulfill labor jobs that Britain needed. And this research by people like Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, Heidi Mertzer, Hazel Cobby is very important. However, Liverpool is very different from every other Black community in Britain. There were far more Africans than West Indians, far more long-term citizens than recent immigrants and settlers. Liverpool had the highest proportion of interracial marriages and people of mixed racial origins in the nation. And Black community, unlike in other cities, was forced into one neighborhood. In addition, there was a far more vivid collective memory in Liverpool of slavery and first-hand knowledge of imperialism because the Black community had been there so long. So the goal of the book is to describe how and why Black Liverpool was different. And more importantly, how did these differences, historical, structural, demographic, and cultural, how did they shape transnational Black culture? And the role and activities of Black women, of gender ideologies that try to constrain Black women, the agency and activities of Black women are central to the book. So that's the overall goal.
Now, African Americans are in your subtitle. How do they fit into your story?
Well, African Americans are very important, or Afro-Americans as they were called. And Afro-Americans had more influence in terms of transnational culture in Britain as well as Liverpool than anywhere else, whether across the diaspora, whether Jamaica or Brazil or the Caribbean or even Africa. So Afro-Americans are very important, and we see their presence, tiny numbers numerically, but a very large impact symbolically and substantively in terms of music, film, television, literature, Black studies, civil rights, and role models in education and politics, as well as business. And colloquially, I like to say that at this time in the 70s and 80s, Afro-Americans were the coolest Black people on the planet, and Black people and others in Liverpool were influenced by them. So first of all, in Liverpool, there's the significance of soul music, in particular, a nightclub called The Timepiece, which was the most popular, the most influential, and the most valued of all nightclubs for music. But also, I argue that this nightclub was the embodiment of Afro-American pride, self-respect, originality, and creativity. There were also a significant number of Afro-American men, GIs from American bases across the country, that came to Liverpool frequently, and a number of them married local Black and mixed race women. The other thing that's important in Liverpool and that's unique is the establishment of what was effectively a young Black Panther Party. It was called the Green Jackets. And the final thing to say is that organizations in Liverpool like the Black Church, a community project, the Methodist Youth Club, and other organizations showed extensively aspects of Afro-American culture. Oh, excuse me, there is one other thing. Important Afro-Americans from people like Martin Luther King, Kwame Ture, Angela Davis visited London, and some of them visited Liverpool. For example, Yankaroo visited Liverpool, Malefa Asante visited Liverpool. So this was the impact, substantively, symbolically. So that's what I would say are some of the key elements.
Yes, and continental Africans are in your subtitle as well. How do they fit into your story?
Okay. Well, one of the distinctive features of Liverpool compared to every other city with a black community is that there was a much higher proportion of Africans rather than Caribbeans. And the reason for this is that after the slave trade, the enslavement of Africans ended legally in the British Empire, far more Africans, especially men, arrived in Liverpool, particularly from the year 1900, than West Indies. These men were overwhelmingly sailors or stowaways, and when they got to Liverpool, they were often discarded by the ships they had worked on and replaced with white workers, so they stayed there. So there was a high proportion of African men, and this led to extensive interracial marriage and to the growth of a population of mixed race people. At the start of the 70s, I argue that an African identity, except amongst African immigrants themselves, was not very popular. But then an African identity became very popular. And it first became popular because of reggae and Rastafari that told black people, especially younger black people in the community, about His Imperial Majesty, Haile Selassie, about African kingdoms like Benin and Dahomey, told us about African resistance and independence movements, and give us the names of people like Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and others. So African identity became more and more, African engagement became more and more important. We also know that in Liverpool, there were many African families. Many of them were interracial families with names like Mensah, Mendy, Osu, Ogumbura. Liverpool in the 70s and 80s also had far more African clubs than any other city in Britain, including London. Clubs like the Igbo, the Sierra Leone, the Yoruba, and others. There were organizations like the Merseyside African Council. And as black people in Liverpool began to embrace African knowledge and information in opposition to the nonsense we had been taught in schools, a number of African-focused organizations developed, like the Steve Biko Housing Association, the Lardo Drum and Dance Company, and Elamu Academy, which had begun as a library and a project, but then became an independent school led by the city's first black head teacher, Gloria Hyatt. So in all these ways, Africa became central, and people like Sonia Bassi and Ray Wallace, local black people, were central to these activities, and their legacy is still present. Of course, there were also still, continuing arrivals of African men as sailors or students, and they shared information and knowledge about resistance and resilience in Africa. So there are some of the features that I highlight in the book, and I give examples and I give descriptions.
Along that line, what about black people from the Caribbean? What role do they play in your story?
Okay, again, following Afro-American and African influence, Caribbean influence also became big, and for a while was one of the biggest. So first and foremost, reggae music and Rastafari told black people we learned more about Africa from the Caribbean, from reggae, from Rastafari, than we did directly from Africa itself. We got information about African kingdoms, African leaders, via reggae music, interviews, and so on. Many of the young people that embraced reggae were of mixed racial origins. Many of them had African fathers. Some had Caribbean fathers like myself. My dad was Jamaican. And we found out more and more about the Caribbean, again, in contrast to some of the racial stereotypes and what's now called the colonial education that we were receiving in British schools. There were a number of organizations, and there were West Indians who had settled in Liverpool, Jamaicans, Trinidadians, Barbadians, Caucasians, and we learned from them directly too. Organizations like World Promotions, and before World Promotions, Stanley House, and people like Herbie Higgins had developed the carnival, and so that became central. And then finally, I would add, there was a number of other organizations. For example, one of the most important is the Charles Wotton Center, which became the Charles Wharton College. And they offered courses, they offered information. So all of these things provided substantial information that contradicted some of the nonsense we'd gotten in schools, and also was symbolically important in many ways for Black men and for Black women. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And I would argue that before these transnational influences, the minds of young Black people like me, I was a teenager in the 70s, the goal of British education, I would say, was largely to colonize our minds. And these transnational influences, which expanded massively from the 70s, helped us to begin the process of decolonizing our minds.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
You alluded to gender ideologies previously. Any more to add about that?
Yeah, I would say this. The role of gender ideologies in shaping and constraining women, Black and white, the activities of Black women and their agency, their priorities, their goals is absolutely central to the book. What I demonstrate based on my research is that Black women were often the majority in almost all of the organizations I mentioned. They were often leaders or directors in some of those organizations. And when these organizations, Black organizations, failed to really respond to Black women's priorities, Black women set up other organizations like Liverpool Black Sisters, like Amadudu Women's Collective, and Mary Seacole House, which was open to the entire community, but primarily, I would argue, for Black women. So Black women are there centrally to juxtapose them. I juxtapose them with what they share in common with Black men in terms of goals and priorities, the obstacles that they faced, and how they prioritized their work. And I mentioned the names of organizations. I mentioned the names of key individuals like Dorothy Kuya, like Claire Dove, like Gloria Hyatt, Michelle Charters, Sonia Bassi. One of my goals is to make sure that the names of these women and men are documented for other people to learn.
You alluded to Rasta a moment or two ago. Anything to add about that?
Well, Rastafari, again, played a very important role. It showed us positive images of Black men and some women who refused to accept the cultural indoctrination of the British Empire that white was right and Black was wrong. Rastafari led many people to the Bible and to different interpretations of the Bible. And I actually have several friends, a small number, who actually were illiterate before Rastafari came, and they learned to read and write in order to read the Bible and understand Rastafari. Rastafari was also central to one of the biggest organizations in Britain, African Liberation Day, which brought together Black people from across the continent and across the diaspora in England to combat and challenge apartheid in Southern Africa. So Rastafari played a very important role, and I describe it in terms of its secular activities, cultural activities, and also in terms of its faith and religious activities.
Finally, Stephen Small, author of the book Black Liverpool, is it coincidental that, in light of what you have just depicted in the last few moments, that the Beatles were formed in Liverpool?
Well, you know, I've found in the many years I've given presentations on Liverpool, I'm almost always asked about two things. One is the Beatles and one is soccer, what Americans call soccer. With regard to soccer, I say this, nothing. Liverpool's reputation stands for itself. I don't need to add anything else. With regard to the Beatles, I say the following. For a short while, the Beatles had a Black manager, Harold Phillips, also known as Lord Woodbine. He was a Calypsonian from Trinidad who was their manager for a short while and who brought them to Hamburg. This reflects the fact that Calypso was the most popular Caribbean music in Liverpool and in England in the 50s and 60s before reggae came about. So Paul McCartney has acknowledged that Woodbine played a significant role. We're learning more and more about Lord Woodbine, and more information will come out. One other thing I say about the Beatles, which I find amusing, is when people ask me, I say, listen, I was 6 years old when the Beatles were famous, and so they had no relevance to me. My interest really began with Bob Marley.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Stephen Small, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you, Gerald.
Thanks again to Professor Small for joining us. And for all of you listeners out there, we are not done yet. We're going right back to Dr. Horne for one more conversation, this time with Professor Richard Meiselle. Take it away, Dr. Horne.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Richard Meiselle, Associate Professor of History at the University of Houston, author of the book Backwater Blues, The Mississippi Flood of 1927 in the African American Imagination. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Richard Meiselle.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Horne. I appreciate it.
And we appreciate your accepting the invitation. So why did you produce this book?
Well, I was interested initially in the migration, and the Great Migration was a theme that, or is a theme that runs through much of my scholarship, monographs as well as articles. And so I was interested in thinking about ways in which I could talk about the Great Migration, but I also then became interested in this really interesting, fascinating disaster of the 1927 flood, which at that time, there were one or two books, but none that really sort of framed it within this conversation of movement. And so in many ways, that was the pivot, that was the base of my tackling this environmental disaster. Thinking about the ways in which Black people moved from the flooded landscapes of the Mississippi Delta to Chicago, to Detroit, to Milwaukee. It didn't actually turn out that way in terms of that migration pattern. I actually began to think about another migration pattern, which is to say migration from the Louisiana hinterlands to Texas, to Beaumont, to Houston, and the development of this really interesting community in Houston known as Frenchtown, in which self-described Creoles of color or Black Creoles migrated after the disaster to these areas in Texas, which I think really situated quite nicely with a growing trend within Great Migration scholarship, which was to think about the ways in which their people moved locally, or from the rural South to urban South, urban Southern landscapes, or the rural South to the urban South. And so that was in many ways the footprint or the start of this manuscript. But also in the process, I much of the argument revolves around this idea of the double burden or a double environmental burden of race, which is to say that Black people throughout the 20th century, but particularly during this disaster, suffered not only from an environmental disaster, but also from social, political, racial violence within the Jim Crow South in this example, and the ways in which flood survivors had to deal with all of those particularities of being Black, but also trying to deal with an environmental disaster. So it's part of the way in which people used, the American Red Cross, for example, used food as a disciplinary tool, so that when these Black individuals, flood survivors in the Mississippi Delta would go into Red Cross relief camps, food was used as a source of labor. They could not receive food until they first worked on the levee or reconstructing the levee. Wives and children would not receive food unless the husbands or men of the family went out and worked for the day. And they were guarded in these levee camps by force from the National Guard, but also sometimes from local Boy Scout troops who were armed. And so there was, in many ways, this moment in which the movement of Black people out of the South was guarded and armed during the Great Migration. But the related point to that as well is that I framed this book within this conversation of a diaspora, a flood diaspora, which is to say that we can't really understand the 1927 flood as just one particular moment. Black people throughout the country understood what was going on in the Mississippi Delta through Black newspapers, through word of mouth. We'll get to the blues later, but that was an important sort of conversation tool around what was occurring in the Mississippi Delta. So when people were moving to different parts of the country, when they were hearing about the Mississippi Delta, they then began to sort of respond to the disaster in their own particular way. And circumscribed the American Red Cross, because there were all of these sort of conversations around how charity was being racialized, and that people were giving money to the American Red Cross, but it was going to white sufferers only. And importantly, I make the case within the early part of this book that Southerners were never as opposed to federalism as we sometimes are want to believe. They're okay with federalism. They're okay with money coming outside of the South, as long as they can use that money or marshal that money in the way in which they see fit, which in this case was often marshaling towards white flood survivors. So this book is really about how the 1927 flood connected to a much broader diaspora of Blackness, in the sense that people became aware of what was going on in the region, many of whom had relatives or were from the South as well, and they responded in kind in various ways. One form was charity, other forms were writing and describing and political organizing. And so this flood diaspora, I think, sort of breaks the 1927 flood out of this sort of localism and pushes it towards a much broader narrative.
Now, many in our audience no doubt are familiar with Katrina in that general vicinity further south of New Orleans for the most part in 2005. How would you compare 1927 to 2005?
So I think that there are a number of comparisons. One of the comparisons that comes to mind initially is just that movement I was talking about. Where people moved from Louisiana to Frenchtown. There was a similar movement, as we know, after Katrina, as people were displaced to not only Houston, but Baton Rouge, to as far away as Denver, all over the country. So there was, in many ways, a similar version of displacement. One of the things that I think often gets undermined or is not as accurate is the sort of idea that sort of levees in Katrina were sort of a direct result of the 1927 flood. In other words, after the 1927 flood, Congress passes the 1928 Flood Control Act, which helps to strengthen levee construction throughout the Mississippi Valley, but also throughout the country as well. And so some people have argued that the lack of control or the lack of federal presence in the construction of levees, even beyond the 1920s and 1930s, directly led to what was occurring in Katrina. But a more realistic version is that Katrina was in many ways a result of failed levee planning and flood wall planning in the aftermath of Hurricane Betsy in 1965, in which there was a momentum to really sort of push levee construction around New Orleans in particular, but also what we now know as the Gulf Coast. But for a number of reasons, those levees were not completed. And even in the midst of what was ultimately a Category 3, some would argue a Category 2 in certain places that inundated levees around New Orleans, that led to substantial breaches around New Orleans. But there are also various ways in which we sort of compare that I've often compared New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina, which is to say that in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, there was some rumors that levees were being deliberately blown up to save certain parts of the city. That actually has a historical precedent during the 1927 flood. When politicians around New Orleans decided to deliberately blow up the rural hinterlands around New Orleans to save the city. These were mostly muskrat, fur trapping regions of Louisiana that were deliberately destroyed to save New Orleans. You see sort of similar rumors around Hurricane Betsy, where these conversations of levees being destroyed were raised once again, but also during Hurricane Katrina as well. Now, I also think that during Hurricane Katrina, you see these conversations around charity. And one of the very few bright spots of Hurricane Katrina was the mobilization of charity throughout the country. Many people still circumscribing the American Red Cross and deciding to give money through local churches, through local organizations. I think you can directly link that back to sort of this sort of mistrust of the American Red Cross in the 40s and 50s with the blood controversies, but also all the way back to the 1927 flood as well. And so when people were donating sort of money, donating resources, they found their own ways of doing so, and I think that has historical precedent as well.
So you mentioned the impact of the 1927 flood on the blues. Could you elaborate?
So, one of the things that's interesting about the 1927 flood is that, there were similar floods, right? So the 1922 flood was very serious. There were seasonal floods throughout the early 1920s and, throughout the late 19th century. One of the things that the 1927 flood does is that it occurs at a moment in which the blues was changing form. So late 19th, early 20th century, the blues was primarily a personal correspondence. Like anyone could sing the blues, right? You have the beginning of the semester blues that I might sing, right? So this is my own sort of personal distrust or misgivings about whatever. Right, but it was intensely personal. It was sort of internal. But by the 1920s and 1930s, in part through the evolution of what we call sort of race records, as problematic as they were in many ways, the blues began to change form, and it became much more of a sort of group dynamic or sort of expression of group experiences. So you saw the blues talk much more about sharecropping or the peonage labor system or police brutality. And so the 1927 flood was one of the first disasters in which you have this sort of broad scale marshaling of blues musicians who were talking about a single disaster. And of course, this is at a time when most disasters were local occurrences, right? You have, local Florida hurricanes. That's how they were understood, local tornadoes. What's interesting about the 1927 flood was that for a moment, for 6-7 months in the spring of 1927, the entire country captivated by this single disaster. And that was really unusual outside of major wars. For most people, the most that they interacted with the federal government was checking their mail. But the federal government, in its own way, began to sort of bend towards the 1927 flood a little bit. And so blues musicians, in the midst of sort of thinking about how the country was responding to this, how individuals throughout the country were responding, how they had also experienced, brutality through floods, but also police brutality, sharecropping, peonage themselves who migrated, these blues musicians who might have migrated to Kansas City or Chicago or New York, and began singing about this, their experiences, this became part of the collective experiences of the 1927 flood. And so, some people ask me, or they've asked me in the past, were these blues musicians, did they experience the flood themselves, right? And the answer to that is mostly no. There's some anecdotal information that Charlie Patton was on the ground during the 1927 flood in the Mississippi Delta. Others have said that Matty Delaney personally experienced it. But for the most part, these blues musicians recorded these songs in the 1930s. But again, the newspapers, the back and forth with individuals throughout the country sort of framed how they talked about the disaster. But you also have a shaping of, or shifting rather, of the ways in which blues musicians were sort of defining, which is to say, it switches in many ways to this AAB format. AAB format means that they might repeat a line 2 times, and then that third B or that third hook either counters or provides a anecdote or provides something that is sort of historically relevant or sort of interesting in terms of personal experiences. So one song that comes to mind, they accused me of murder, I haven't harmed a man. They accused me of murder, I haven't harmed a man. They even accused me of forgery, and I can't write my name, right? So that's an example of the AAB format. But blues musicians also talked very explicitly at times about what was occurring during the 1927 flood. So, for example, Sippy Wallace talks about the blowing of levees, which was in many ways historically accurate, not just in New Orleans, but in various communities throughout the Mississippi Valley. Communities were on guard for rival communities or other communities, adjacent communities, to deliberately sacrifice their levees to try to save themselves. So levees are inundated, or levees can break in 3 ways. Water can go over the top, water can go through, or water can go around and come back on the backside. But for many people, they felt like if they could sacrifice a neighbor, then that would lessen the threat in their own communities. And so blues musicians highlighted that for the world to see. They highlighted the airplanes from the Coast Guard. They highlighted the Coast Guard, but also Army airplanes that were flying above, documenting. They highlighted what was going on in Red Cross relief camps, right? So they highlighted all of these things for the world to listen to. And I make the argument that in the absence of sort of primary source documents preserved by historical collections, that blues musicians and blues songs represent some of our earliest sort of firsthand accounts into the 1927 flood.
Well, just to pivot for a second, Richard Meiselle, we know that you are preparing a book on diabetes. Talk to us about that project and how and why you got into it.
Well, I got into that project in many ways because of the 1927 flood. Most people, it might be difficult to sort of see that connection. But Katrina is relevant here as well. In the aftermath of finishing my dissertation, I began to, which was around 2005, 2006, I began to do work on Hurricane Katrina and sort of questions of public health, special needs populations, individuals who were suffering from diabetes and asthma who could not evacuate. And so from there, I developed an interest in diabetes. And so Katrina is in many ways representative of the long-standing vulnerability of Black people to chronic disease, but also other questions of public health. So this book deals with primarily Black people in the 20th century and thinks about, in many ways, the ways in which sort of questions of science evolved over time, but also questions in sort of the scientific etiology of what we think of as type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and in some ways type 3 diabetes, and how those sort of narratives have become racialized and changed over time, just as a way of putting a sort of framework on it. today, and this sort of has historical relevance, a lot of people think that type 1 diabetes is primarily a disease of whiteness, and what we call type 2 diabetes is a disease of blackness or minority populations. That's not true, of course, but there are sort of historical reasons why those things have evolved, right? And so my book sort of highlights the ways in which these sort of scientific ideologies have become hardened over time, and the ways in which sort of people have understood disease experience and experiences with diabetes, including insulin, throughout the 20th century.
And we also know that you're preparing a book on lupus. What is lupus, and what do you plan to say about it?
Well, lupus, of course, is one of the most significant autoimmune diseases that have emerged as a public health threat in the 20th century. That really, in many ways, evolved out of this first book on diabetes, which is to say that what we think of now as type 1 diabetes is in part an autoimmune disease. And so by the 1950s, 1960s, there was sort of growing attention to autoimmunity and sort of how we understand autoimmune diseases. And so Black women in particular suffer disproportionately from lupus, and that is a result of a lack of diagnosis, lack of sort of access to various resources, but also lack of understanding around sort of questions of autoimmunity and environment and stress, and what different types of environmental circumstances play in terms of why different groups suffer from different diseases. And so this work on lupus is, in my mind, at this moment at least, much more of a public-facing book, more of a policy analysis of lupus, probably from the 1950s and 1960s to the present. And it's sort of used as a way of thinking about how we can design policy as a way of protecting individuals who are most vulnerable to certain chronic diseases, but also broader questions of diagnosis and surveillance and sort of thinking about all of the politics of why certain people suffer from certain diseases.
Well, Richard Meiselle, author of the book Backwater Blues, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, starting with Professor Jess Waggoner from the University of Wisconsin and author of the book Black Crip Modern, Race, Gender, and the Roots of Disability Consciousness. We also thank Professor Stephen Small of UC Berkeley's Graduate Division and author of the book Black Liverpool, The Real Thing, West African, West Indian, and Afro-American Culture at the End of the 20th Century. Lastly, we thank Professor Richard Meiselle, representing the University of Houston, and his book Backwater Blues, The Mississippi Flood of 1927 and the African American Imagination. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Word to producer Sister Tej. A special shout out to our spiritual backbone, Freedom Now founder and ancestor Babadilan Kamati. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program as well at freedomnow@kpfk.org, but that's not all. Go to the audio archives on kpfk.org, scroll down to Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. With that, we send you off, and until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.